Strategic and International Studies. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Director of Global Food Security here at CSIS. Before we begin, just a brief safety announcement. We don't anticipate any issues, but if something comes up, I am your security officer, and I will direct you towards the exits. So today, you're here for the launch of our great new report that really dives into mostly Mozambique and Malawi, looking at the crisis that swept across southern Africa due to the devastating drought of El Nino. I won't go into the particulars about that because my colleague Richard Downey will do a deep dive presentation to teach you more about what's happened there. Many of you may have come to an event that we launched at the end of March of this year where we started looking at El Nino, and then we've continued to track this issue, including taking a research trip to the countries that I mentioned. Part of the concept here was to examine how longer-term development initiatives like Feed the Future are helping vulnerable communities to withstand shocks. But we also wanted to look at and explore how USAID's focus on building resilience is working on the ground, particularly in light of such an extreme crisis. Many of you in this room have probably heard of the Global Food Security Act that was passed this summer, and it made it very clear that building resilience to food shocks to reduce reliance on emergency food aid should be a top policy objective for the United States. And the U.S. Global Food Security Strategy that was submitted yesterday to Congress answered that call. The strategy recognizes the role of frequent and intense shocks and stresses that they have on food security, on nutrition, on poverty. And in fact, when you look at it, which I encourage you to, strengthening resilience amongst people and systems is now one of the top 3 policy objectives of the United States in terms of looking at food security. So alongside with agricultural-led economic growth and improved nutrition, resilience has now been elevated. And a solid strategy is very important. It's one step in the right direction, but ultimately it's words. It's about the implementation, it's about the coordination, it's about funding, it's about robust staff, and it's about having a flexible implementation on the ground to see how we can actually respond to crisis, which unfortunately has become the new norm. As we begin today, I just want to thank a few of my colleagues. You will meet them later. Jennifer Cook, who's the director of our Africa program, Richard Downey, who's the deputy director of the Africa program, as well as Reed Hamill, a research fellow on our team, is the CSIS group that went to Mozambique and Malawi to do and conduct research for this paper. And Richard Downey, who you'll hear a full presentation from him, he's been a great colleague. He's a captivating writer, which you'll see when you read the report. And as you'll also see in a minute, he could have a career as a voiceover artist because he's also very good at creating a narrative for a film. And as I introduce the film, I just want to recognize, I see him in the back, Sam Ellis, raise your hand. Sam is a multimedia producer here at CSIS with our Ideas Lab. He's worked with us on a number of our multimedia films that multimedia products that we've produced. This is actually his last week at CSIS, and also this is his last piece of art that he's helped produce here. And he's a great, very talented young man with a promising career ahead of him, and we're just really grateful for you, Sam, and we'll miss you. So to begin with the film, it's a short film, it's just a few minutes, but it really gives you a visual of their trip. It sort of lays the foundation for the dialogue and sort of sets the tone for our discussion today.
Here in southern Africa, the rains have failed for the 2nd year in a row. The land is parched, crops have been decimated, livestock are dying, people are going hungry. It's a picture repeated across 10 countries in the region, where around 40 million people will likely need emergency assistance before the year is out. The cause? El Nino, a cyclical feature of our climate system that causes the Pacific Ocean to warm and triggers abnormal weather conditions across the world. The 2015-16 installment was one of the strongest on record, and it's causing havoc in southern Africa. CSIS saw the impact for itself in June during a visit to Mozambique and Malawi. As always, the poorest have been hardest hit, and there's particular concern for 2 especially vulnerable groups, children and people living with HIV. Both groups can get sick very quickly if they don't get enough food and the right kind of food. Governments in the affected countries are struggling to cope with this crisis. The United States is helping, along with other donors. These communities in southern Mozambique receive vouchers they can exchange for food. These efforts have already saved lives.
Hi wondza hinkwenu ku nga na nkulukumba ku nga na xihlangi hinkwenu hi liva madyala loko se va ta hi kuma vo hi hlamala.
But support isn't reaching all those who need it. Humanitarian appeals are massively underfunded. Even those who receive assistance can barely sustain themselves because, as this woman explained, food prices are climbing, reducing the value of their vouchers. And the worst is yet to come. Many of the hardest hit parts of southern Africa won't see another harvest until next spring, and that's assuming the weather cooperates. People in this part of Africa are used to coping with the tough conditions, but increasingly erratic weather patterns, exacerbated by climate change, are putting immense strain on households. Aid agencies are trying to build resilience among communities vulnerable to natural disasters and food shocks. Dorothy Namula and her family are among those to benefit from one such project, run by the US Agency for International Development in Malawi's Balaka district. Fides Kasamale is a nutrition assistant in USAID's Feed the Future project in Dorothy's district. He tries to get farmers to grow a more diverse array of crops. He says changing behaviour takes time, but his efforts are starting to pay off.
And I expect this year we will have a lot of people growing different crops like the soya, the groundnuts, maize of course, sorghum, and not only the crops, even the keeping of livestock in their homes.
The aim is that families like Dorothy's will get the tools and know-how to grow a wider variety of crops and achieve higher yields. Not only will the food they produce offer a more diverse diet that keeps them healthy, it will provide a regular surplus that can be sold at the market. But it's hard work to sustain livelihoods in the face of these repeated shocks. Breaking the cycle of crisis will require governments in the region to prioritise policy reform to strengthen markets and incentivise change. Greg Collins helps countries build up their resilience capacities.
And the great thing is we're starting to see good examples of country-led efforts that we can point to. So when I was in Malawi, a lot of what I talked to the government about was what Kenya had done, what Ethiopia has done, even what the government in Niger is doing to own this risk and get ahead of recurrent crisis, to deal with it proactively.
Positive change won't be easy and it won't come overnight. But it is possible with the commitment of host governments and the assistance of international partners like the United States, not only to meet today's crisis, but to prevent tomorrow's from occurring. Hello everyone, I am the voice from the video, which as Kimberly explained was shot in Mozambique and Malawi back in June as this food crisis was just beginning to unfold. And I want to echo the thanks that Kimberly's already made and thank Jennifer Cook and Reed Hamill who were part of this trip and conducted a lot of the research. Really our aim was to take a close look at the impacts of the drought, see how the response was taking shape, and identify some of the main gaps and challenges, of which there were many, at least back in June. And we were also interested to see how the two countries, these two countries who've been long-term recipients of US development assistance, including significant investments in agriculture, continue to be stuck in this cycle of food insecurity, partly due to climate change. A number of questions came to mind as we embarked upon the trip. First, is this just a particularly bad year in which it's just that much harder to cope? Second, would food insecurity be even worse in the region were it not for US assistance? And third, are there opportunities being missed to use development funds in a smarter way to build resilience of countries like Malawi and Mozambique? But I think the answer to all three of those questions was yes. Regarding the first one, it is clear that for many of the 13 countries in the Southern Africa Development Community region, this really is the worst drought in living memory. El Nino caused the rains to fail at critical moments in the growing cycle, causing harvests to fail completely in some areas that we visited. Across the Southern Africa region, cereal production has been down more than 10% on the previous year, and the previous year was a pretty bad year for many areas as well. And these cumulative crises have worn down the coping mechanisms of the poorest communities who are really now facing a battle for survival. Even in a good year, these are countries where a large proportion of people are undernourished. And this year families have really used up their coping strategies. Many have sold off livestock, used up food reserves. They may have sent family members away in an effort to stave off hunger. One very common fallback strategy is to seek casual employment, often very far from home in different countries sometimes. But the depressed regional economy has ruled that option out for a lot of people. And with harvests low and casual farm labour also in decline, that's also taken away an important source of labour. Even those who do have cash to spend are finding very, very high prices for foodstuffs in the market, and those prices are continuing to rise because we're only just now entering the annual lean season. Turning to the second question, would things have been worse without US assistance? Well, that's a definite yes. It's very clear to us on our visit that US assistance to both countries that we visited has had a huge impact in saving lives already. Already more than $300 million has been committed to this response across the region. I'm sure the number is still rising. The US has been the most generous bilateral donor. Much of the assistance has come in the form of cash or in-kind donations to the World Food Programme, which has been very, very critical organisation in taking the lead in procuring and distributing food or vouchers to communities. And the US isn't just giving food, it's a whole range of activities from water and sanitation programs, nutrition screening, gathering and collecting important data on market trends and food prices, distributing seed, and setting up food for assets programs whereby communities can receive food in return for working on projects that maybe protect natural resources or increase agricultural production. Now, in parallel with these short-term efforts, the US is engaged in longer-term efforts to increase food security in both Malawi and Mozambique. Both countries are part of the President Obama's Feed the Future initiative, which seeks to reduce hunger and stunting by addressing rural poverty, boosting food production and developing agricultural value chains. And Malawi as well also gets development assistance from USAID's Food for Peace program, which supports the very, very poorest rural communities and helps to increase or improve health outcomes and improve hygiene. Now this leads me on to the third question that I posed at the start. Are opportunities being missed to build resilience among the most vulnerable communities? I think we saw very good programs on the ground in both countries, very hardworking and committed staff. But we also found staff working amidst some sort of some policy straitjackets, I guess, working in programs that weren't flexible enough to respond to the changing conditions that they encountered. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, for example, is a huge presence in Southern Africa. It is the source of assistance to many of the countries in this region, where 1/3 of people living with HIV live. But even though the drought can have a particularly damaging health impact on this most vulnerable of communities, funding restrictions on how PEPFAR money can be used mean that PEPFAR so far has only been able to play a bit-part role in the drought response. We also wondered whether Feed the Future could be more closely connected to efforts to feed people now. Of course, that's not its primary job or objective, but of course its success also rides very much on a successful response to the near-term relief effort. In Mozambique, the drought hit areas and the zones where Feed the Future worked were in different parts of the country. So this really limited the ability of program implementers to shift their areas of operation, even if they'd wanted to. In some settings, I think there appears to be a sort of innate tension within Feed the Future between its dual poverty reduction mandate and its market development mandate. It struck us that it was very hard to pursue both goals at the same time in the same places. Now, we can talk at length about US programs and US responses, but ultimately, of course, the responsibility for managing and responding to food crises lies with the host nations themselves. And in both countries, governments lack the capacity, and at times we thought that the political will to make tough policy decisions that would, for example, incentivize farmers, open up markets to agricultural investment, and encourage the production of seeds and other important inputs. The US has been playing an important diplomatic role in pushing, persuading host governments to take more proactive measures to prepare for food shocks rather than sort of starting each year from scratch. But despite these very vocal, important efforts, there's only been moderate progress from what we saw. Of course, building the resilience of nations and communities and families to absorb the kinds of enormous shocks caused by climate variability and climate change, these are very, very difficult tasks to achieve, despite all the efforts of development professionals. And the challenge is made all the harder because for the very poorest people in Southern Africa, these shocks seem to be getting bigger and more frequent by the year. This year, really, in the hardest hit areas that we saw in southern Malawi and southern Mozambique, it's really a matter of survival and not much more for the most vulnerable communities. In Malawi, at the government level, the donors have done a decent job, I think, in aligning around messages about resilience. They've termed it as breaking the cycle of food security in Malawi, and there's been some headway in sensitizing the concept. And of course, while weak government capacity is an issue, there are other examples in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, like in Kenya and Ethiopia, that do offer some cause for optimism. Their governments have got serious about building national level capacities to adapt to and respond to drought. In closing, I'm not going to rehash a lot of the recommendations in our report. You have copies hopefully in front of you and can read them at your leisure. But just to pick out a couple of near-term and longer-term recommendations. First, I think in terms of the near-term response, raising the tempo of advocacy and diplomacy in these months ahead will be really will continue to be very, very important in raising awareness of and funds for a disaster that continues to get crowded out by crises elsewhere in the world. Coordination is always a recommendation that features in so many of our reports, but I think it applies very strongly to the response in Southern Africa right now, both among external partners and the countries that are involved. It's important to note that the US is playing the leading role in terms of the response already. I think in terms of attracting more resources to the response, the US role is to try and advocate for others to step up and pay their share. Another short-term issue is that livelihood recovery must take place in parallel to the relief effort so that we get into another food crisis next year. It's critical as the planting season gets underway this month in many parts of the Southern Africa region to make sure that communities have the seeds and the inputs that they need to do the planting for next year. Now, in terms of longer-term steps, I think more flexible programming is going to be very critical for the United States, and program designers should assume that drought is now a matter of life. It's a common thing that's during the course of an average 3 to 5 year development program, you're going to see a drought occurring in one of those years in Southern Africa. So building in sort of crisis modifiers, as has been described, that allow funds and programs to be repositioned when emergencies strike is very important. I think for initiatives like Feed the Future, it's time to consider relaxing some of the strict targets linked to activities in specific geographic zones and on specific value chains. While these help to bring focus to the initiative, help to strengthen the case that its investments are having impact, they also make the initiative a little bit more rigid than perhaps it should be. Another longer-term consideration is scaling up efforts to help countries develop strong disaster risk reduction plans and institutions. This is a really neglected area of assistance to governments. Less than 0.5% of the global aid budget goes towards mitigating the impact of natural disasters, and yet those investments could save so much money in the long term and human lives as well. And finally, I think it's important as part of this conversation to talk about conditionality and whether it's time to start thinking about placing conditions on governments that do not take proactive measures to remove some of the roadblocks to food security, such as policy barriers to investment, or governments that don't make themselves more accountable. Of course, we all want development to be country-led, but that's still a very distant prospect in a country like Malawi, where the US is actually committing more and more funding by the year to emergency assistance. The trend's going in the wrong direction. And part of the reason, frankly, for this is that the government of Malawi talks the language of ownership, but isn't taking the tough decisions that come with it. We need to get beyond this sort of annual ritual of issuing an emergency appeal. I think one of the problems is that US funding for democracy and governance programs has waned in recent years across Africa as a whole, but the voices of civil society, of political parties, of the media, of parliaments are really, really needed more than ever right now in the midst of this crisis to keep the pressure on host governments to be accountable and to make some corrective policy decisions. I will stop there. I look forward to your comments and responses to the report. But if you don't mind holding your questions for later on, I'd like to invite the rest of our panelists to come and join us on the platform. And I'll hand over to Jennifer Cook, Director of our Africa program, to introduce everyone and continue with the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And thank you to Kimberly for engaging the Africa program in this effort. This was a really exciting and kind of energizing project. While our report kind of looked at the connections between Feed the Future and emergency responses, how, the trade-offs of whether to kind of preserve and insulate long-term development programs from kind of the short-term immediate pressures of crisis. We have a panel today that will look a bit more in depth at the crisis response, both the scale of the crisis and the US and international response. We were there in June. That was just a couple months after the harvest, which in many places failed, in other places was very low. And at this time, people are now moving into what even in a good year is called the hungry season, with very little assets on which to live. And so the prediction then was that this was going to get much worse before it got better. And we have a panel to discuss some of those more recent trend lines. We're delighted. We have a great panel today. We have David Harden, who is Assistant Administrator for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. Obviously, this is enormous portfolio. Most relevant to our discussions within that, it encompasses the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, Food for Peace, and I think the Center for Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance to a certain extent. Enormous demands on your office, not a whole lot of bandwidth in the humanitarian space, so we'll be eager to hear how El Nino fits into that bigger picture as well. David has served in some very tough places, the West Bank and Gaza, Iraq, Libya, but he has long ties to the Southern African region, having served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana at the start out of his career. So it's great to have you working on this. Next, via video, we have Ute Meyer. Ute, can you hear us and see us?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
good
fantastic.
Afternoon or good evening to everybody.
Okay. Ute is the Deputy Country Director for the World Food Program in Mozambique, where she really oversees pretty much the entire portfolio of WFP, from school feeding to resilience building to emergency to the voucher program and so forth. We were impressed in Mozambique and Malawi by the very careful and thorough market analysis that World Food Program does before before launching into some of its emergency assistance. Ms. Meyer also worked in Iraq. She's worked with World Food Program. She's worked in Rome and in partnership with UNESCO focused on school feeding. Finally, we have our long-term friend and colleague, Anne Hollingsworth, who's Senior Advisor for Government Affairs at Refugees International, which has been doing great work lately. She is formerly a Senior Analyst with the International Crisis Group. Anne and her colleague, Alice Thomas, were in Zimbabwe about the same time that we were in Malawi and Mozambique looking at the situation there. They have a report, which I believe copies are outside, called From Bad to Worse, the Deepening Impacts of the Drought in Zimbabwe. So, Anne, thanks so much. It's great to get the broader regional look as well. I'm going to turn to David, and then we're going to go through then to Ute and Anne, and we'll open up for questions.
So, Richard, if the development thing doesn't work out, you need a job in Hollywood, I think you might be primed. For those of you who don't know in intimate detail the World Food Program, their operations on the ground are always quite extraordinary. So, Ute, thanks for calling in from Mozambique. You by far have the coolest context in which you're here. And there are 65 million displaced people on Earth right now. It's the biggest since World War II, so you have a big job ahead of you as well. In 1966, that was 50 years ago, Botswana was the 10th poorest country on Earth. They had practically no human capacity, no institutions, no future. In the mid-'80s, where Dina Esposito, our Food for Peace chief, she cut her teeth on the Ethiopian famine. 2.5 million people died in Ethiopia. In southern Africa during the same time, Botswana could barely hold on as they were struggling with drought. This year, we're not giving a dime to Botswana. They can handle it. It's a shock, for sure. A drought, El Niño drought, is a political, economic, and social shock. It challenges the basics of society, and it challenges the basics of the institutions. And yet, we deem them capable enough to be able to withstand this shock. Right next door in Zimbabwe, where potentially the shock is even less than the semi-arid country of Botswana, we have a tremendous number of food insecure people. And as you talked about, both in Malawi and Mozambique, we're putting the bulk of our money and the bulk of our assistance into those countries. And the point being is that governance counts. Getting the institutions and the leadership and the governing structures right matters. And so, yeah, we have work to do in Malawi, as your example. So this is kind of the framework in which I wanted to set the challenge before us. Now, we've announced $300 million, and of that, $123 million goes to Malawi, and $32 million goes to Mozambique. And yet, we see, and the best example of kind of communicating with our colleagues in Southern Africa is what's happening in Kenya, or how Ethiopia is able to stand that shock, even though they have some governance problems and democracy problems themselves. And the changes that you see in South Africa, Zambia, Namibia, and Botswana. Now, the other thing that's important is to put this in some kind of regional or global context. It's actually important that we get this right. I mean, it's important for the food insecure people. It's important for the women and the children that you had in your film, Richard, because that's just the basic morality of what we do. But it's also important for other reasons. You know, in South Africa, we have an example of post-conflict success. And as we look around the world and we see the 65 million displaced people, and we see kind of the tragedy of Iraq and Syria and Yemen and South Sudan, one day those will be post-conflict societies. And being able to kind of emerge out of those post-conflict, of those conflict situations with institutions that allow them to withstand shocks is going to be important and credible. And that's why not only getting this El Nino response right from a humanitarian perspective, but from a resilience and governing perspective is actually quite critical. It's quite critical for them, but it's quite critical for all of us as global actors. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer.
Okay, fantastic. Ute, we'll turn to you now.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all see and hear me all right.
We can.
And let me first thank you very much for allowing WFP to be a part of this panel, and congratulations and thank you for organizing this. It's really very important. We were happy to host you during your visit to Mozambique, but it's good to now see and be able to discuss the outcome of your visit. Let me just start by referring again, setting the stage a little bit and reminding us of what we are facing currently here in Southern Africa, in the region, but also in Mozambique. As Richard mentioned at the beginning, this is the worst drought in living memory, induced by the most severe El Nino event in a generation. Currently, about 40 million people are estimated to be food insecure in the Southern Africa region up to the beginning of the next harvest season because of this current drought situation. WFP estimates that in the 7 priority countries where the situation is worse in the region, about 40% of the rural population are acutely food insecure. There is strong signs of rising malnutrition affecting particularly children, children under 5, but also pregnant and lactating women. So we are seeing both severe acute malnutrition and also moderate acute malnutrition on the rise. It is also important to keep in mind that the Southern Africa region is one of the regions most affected by HIV and AIDS. And therefore, the food insecurity and the rising malnutrition is also very much affecting people living with HIV and TB. We know, for example, that increasing malnutrition may have effects on deepening HIV vulnerability because when people are malnourished, the antiretroviral treatments may not be working anymore. So this crisis has many different dimensions. In Mozambique in particular, which of course I'm most familiar with, we currently have 1.4 million in the country acutely food insecure, particularly in the center and the south. We also have high acute and severe malnutrition rates. We have just done a food security and nutrition assessment, and for example, 3 out of 11 provinces that were surveyed have nutrition IPC phases in phase 3 and 4, which is quite drastic for those who are familiar with the IPC classification. But let me also say, as Richard has also alluded, very much Mozambique is actually facing many shocks that compound the effects of the drought. So we have other stressors, everything is coming together. First of all, particularly in the south, this is not the first time that people go hungry. This is at least the second consecutive year of drought. In other parts of the country, people are still recovering from the severe flooding that we had early last year. We are indeed going through quite a significant economic crisis, and we have a protracted political crisis. So we also have signs of displacement in the country, both internal displacement and external displacement. This is the current situation, but unfortunately, before it may get better, maybe sometime next year, the situation will first get much worse. In Mozambique, FuseNet estimates that until December we will have about 1.8 million people needing assistance, and the last government food security and nutrition assessment said 2.3 million people may become food insecure from January until the next harvest season. Again, malnutrition rates are also expected to increase in parallel. We have been very worried about another upcoming possible shock related to the rainy season, which is just starting. And as people familiar with the region know, we have quite a regular pattern of rains and flooding, and particularly in Mozambique, where we get a lot of the big rivers and the water that even falls in some of the other countries. I might say maybe somewhat fortunately, the last indications about the La Nina event say that there is less risk of a significant La Nina event. Therefore, for us in Mozambique, less risk of significant additional flooding. But we are still preparing ourselves for what I could call the regular pattern of annual floods and cyclones. On the other hand, having less rain also poses a potential risk for the planting season, for the ability of people to plant, which is, of course, absolutely critical to foresee a way out of this current drought and food security crisis. Along with the need for rain, and Richard has also alluded to that, we need seeds. This is another problem that we currently have. FAO has done a study and has seen that at least on the commercial sector, unfortunately, there's not enough seeds available. In the region overall, the crisis is deepening, and WFP foresees that we have to reach about 13 million people in the region by January. There are also particular grave concerns for some countries, including, for example, Madagascar, which is not often talked about, but southern Madagascar again presents many combinations of different shocks along with being affected by the current drought. Let me just also briefly touch upon what Richard has also mentioned, namely that unfortunately this current situation is not new for Mozambique and the region. It reveals a lot of underlying problems and structural challenges. First of all, climate change. Mozambique is one of the countries most affected by climate change. This crisis is an early indication of the even greater food and nutrition shocks which climate change will bring over the next decades. So clearly climate change is to be taken very seriously. But also we can see that some of our ability to respond to the drought and the effects of the drought reveal challenges in longer-term food and nutrition security and social safety nets programs. We have longer-term issues around strengthening food and nutrition security in the country. Many good initiatives are there, but clearly it is never enough. How does WFP respond? We respond through a combination of interventions. First of all, of course, we are very much concerned with meeting the immediate food and nutrition needs. In the region, WFP is trying to scale up currently to reach about 8 million people by October and more than 13 million by January. In Mozambique, we are currently implementing various programs, Food for Assets, which not only meets household food security needs, but also allows creating livelihoods assets. We are involved in treatment for moderate acute malnutrition, and we have started emergency school feeding because the drought is also forcing more children to abandon school, which again in itself, as you can imagine, has many longer-term negative effects. WFP is actively involved in the coordination of the humanitarian response, both in country and at regional level. And yes, we also work together with partners and trying to build resilience and support food and nutrition security in the longer term. We do this under the chapeau of the multi-sector El Niño Action Plan, which has been launched by the Southern Africa Regional Interagency Standing Committee, a long word. We use the acronym of RIASCO, which also has the 3 pillars of relief, resilience building, and mitigating the economic impacts of the drought. In Mozambique, I would also like to mention that we are working with the government on longer-term food and nutrition security, helping the government to operationalize the Sustainable Development Goal 2, just approved last year, which is, of course, the new policy and development framework for all food security, nutrition, agricultural, hunger alleviation efforts. And I might say we are also working with PEPFAR in an important program. And let me just say here that maybe I would like to caution a little bit. Some of our experience with PEPFAR has been really quite positive. PEPFAR is one of the main donors for the Nutrition Rehabilitation Program, which is the government's continuing program to treat moderate acute malnutrition. And PEPFAR is doing very good work there. And so we're working together with USAID PEPFAR in this context also. Just to close, I know I need to close.
You're fine, yep.
What are some of the main challenges? Of course, number one challenge is always resourcing. We are grateful for the support received, including from the US government, but it is not enough, unfortunately. The region currently needs urgently almost $4 million to respond adequately to the needs until next April. And in Mozambique, we have a shortfall of about 24 million. But also it is very important to raise and maintain awareness for the magnitude and severity of this emergency. We know it's a challenge, but so again, really thank you to CSIS for taking this initiative and giving us this opportunity to do just that. So let me stop here, and I'll be happy to add more information and local perspective in responding to any comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jutta. That was great. Let's turn to Anne for the picture from Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much. Thank you to CSIS for organizing today's panel. As Jennifer mentioned, I was in Zimbabwe and South Africa with my colleague Alice Thomas as we were looking at the El Niño impact and the drought response. We traveled to some of the hardest hit provinces in Zimbabwe, including Matabeleland North and Masvingo, while going to the capital Harare, and then on to South Africa to look at how Zimbabwe was fitting into the regional response. Before I dive in, for those of you not familiar with Refugees International, we advocate for life-saving assistance and protection for displaced people. We are an independent organization and do not accept any government or United Nations funding. So, the challenge, and some of this has been covered already, that will sound a little familiar. But as far as the Zimbabwe case study, I think it's really important for us to look at, in a place that's very prone to droughts, why is now different? There are several reasons why for the Zimbabwe context. First of all, 2 consecutive years of poor rains, compounded by El Niño, have resulted in the worst drought in 35 years. Impacts on agriculture, livestock, and food security have been severe. Maize production in Zimbabwe for 2015 to 2016 is about 35 to 50% below the 5-year average.
The country's global acute malnutrition, or GAM rate, for children under 5 is at 5.7%, the highest in 15 years. Exacerbating the impact of the drought in Zimbabwe are decades of underdevelopment and poor governance that have left 72% of Zimbabweans living below the poverty line. The HIV/AIDS rate in Zimbabwe is about 15%, one of the highest in sub-Saharan Africa. And those with medication must take it with food. A lack of access to that necessary food is an additional concern which we raise in our report. While there is some limited technical capacity, the Zimbabwe government has neither the funds nor the human resources to launch a response on the scale necessary to save lives. As a result of the government's failure to maintain irrigation and water management infrastructure and undertake much-needed land reform, the vast majority of the country's farmers are entirely dependent on rain-fed agriculture to survive. Zimbabwe is now facing an acute liquidity crisis, and cash is difficult to access. Salaries to civil servants and even police and military have been delayed in recent months. Protests over the decades of government corruption, injustice, and ineptitude have emerged, and violent clashes have erupted in the streets. And it has already been described, Southern Africa is dealing with enormous challenges themselves, and Zimbabwe's neighbors are less able to assist should conditions in Zimbabwe seriously decline. A March 2016 regional supply chain assessment by the World Food Programme indicates that despite surpluses in Tanzania and Zambia, 10 million metric tons of cereal will need to be imported from outside of the region in order to meet needs. And the humanitarian community is very stretched. As an example, the United Nations Office for the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, has an office in South Africa, but its portfolio covers both East Africa and Southern Africa, and it's dealing with significant budget constraints for the Southern Africa response. So over 4 million people in Zimbabwe will require emergency humanitarian aid to get to them through the next lean season, which is from October 2016 to March 2017. Responsible contingency planning is absolutely essential, as the situation in Zimbabwe is unfortunately expected to get much worse. So briefly, I wanted to cover the current funding appeals. First off, in February 2016, President Mugabe declared a state of disaster due to the drought. The government appealed for $1.5 billion in national and international assistance to respond. Second, the United Nations Current Humanitarian Response Plan, or HRP, which runs from April 2016 to March 2017, is based on the findings of a Rural and Livelihoods Assessment undertaken by the Zimbabwe Vulnerability Assessment Committee, or ZIMVAC. The appeal is for about $360 million, and as of right now, it's about 19% funded. And finally, in July 2016, the Southern Africa Development Community, or SADC, released an appeal for $2.4 billion to cover an estimated 23 million people across the region, which will require urgent humanitarian assistance over the next 8 months. The United States pledged $127 million, and $54.5 million of that will go to Zimbabwe. So shifting to humanitarian assistance and challenges that we saw in Zimbabwe, to take a step back, it's important to note that in 2013-2014, there was a shift into a development resiliency programming approach in much of the international assistance strategies for Zimbabwe. USAID, in our view, smartly kept in crisis modifiers to their programming, which allows for essential flexibility when conditions on the ground change. USAID and its lead partner, the World Food Programme, have begun to supplement cash assistance with in-kind food assistance, which in our view is absolutely essential based on what we saw on the ground. However, other major donors, including the UK and the European Union, have been resistant to switching to in-kind food assistance. There is a risk that food prices could spike in the months ahead, and that beneficiaries may not be able to purchase sufficient amounts of food unless program budgets are increased and the amount of cash per beneficiary is scaled up. So in our view, donors must adopt more flexible funding mechanisms and approaches that allow implementing partners to better balance immediate humanitarian needs with resilience and long-term development objectives. So I wanted to switch into who we talked with on the ground and what we saw when we were in Zimbabwe.
Numerous rural communities that we spoke with reported that their families had not been able to grow any crops at all this year, despite having planted 3 or more times due to erratic rainfall. As we drove around the rural areas, you could see scorched crops at almost every turn. In several villages in Masvingo, families who were not receiving international assistance reported that they were down to 1 meal a day. When I asked a mother what she would do without the food assistance from the international community, she said she would have to go find wild fruits for her and her children, as she had no harvest and no money. Interviews in Matabeleland North and Masvingo confirmed that mothers were often skipping meals in order to provide what little food was available to their children. We also visited several schools where teachers reported that increasing numbers of children were coming to school without having eaten and with nothing to eat during the break. In one school in Binga district, a school teacher told us that 3 children had recently collapsed due to hunger. And it's important to note that the children actually walk several miles a day to get to these schools. The few schools that can offer a school lunch program, and most of those are through private donors in Zimbabwe, have skyrocketing enrollment because this is a guaranteed meal for the child. Unfortunately, many parents cannot afford the school fees, and so children are either expelled or they drop out to help out at home. So what needs to be done? As we all have mentioned, funding. Donors and United Nations agencies must immediately scale up funding and capacity to address the worsening of the crisis between now and March 2017. And if I could, I'm going to steal Richard's comment about coping mechanisms are absolutely worn out. This is exactly what we saw in Zimbabwe. Second, the United Nations Humanitarian Country Team must put in place monitoring mechanisms to continually monitor food security and market access throughout the 2016-2017 lean season to ensure that cash-based assistance continues to be effective in the face of the country's liquidity crisis. Third, we've all talked about PEPFAR. I want to be a little more specific. We believe that PEPFAR should prioritize support to assist drought-affected HIV-positive Zimbabweans with food assistance to accompany their medication through their Food with Prescription program. And finally, the international stakeholders must implement a comprehensive multi-sector approach that not only supports the drought's impacts on food security, but also sufficiently addresses water and sanitation, health, nutrition, and protection. And let me just speak a moment about protection. Protection has received very little funding in this response so far in Zimbabwe, and new reporting is reflecting additional protection concerns for women and children. This is a really important side of the story that needs to be fully funded. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to turn to the audience for some questions. Just one comment and maybe a question to our panelists. David, you said governance counts, and I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that we came away with was, the best strategy for resilience is good governance and sound evidence-based agricultural policy. And in a place like Malawi or Mozambique, there are a number of policy obstacles that just have not been overcome. It's striking that Mozambique produces enough food to fulfill its demand needs, but it's produced in the north, and it's almost impossible to ship it southward. As Richard notes in the report, it's more expensive to ship food from the north of Mozambique to the south of Mozambique where it's needed than it is to ship from the north to India. Infrastructure and port rehabilitation, for example. In Mozambique, things like an export ban and difficulty getting export licenses, an agricultural marketing board that is extremely opaque and is kind of used as a political slush, Malawi, political slush fund is important. Seed laws, fertilizer laws, all of these are things that are within reach of the government, but there just hasn't been the urgency to undertake them. And I think one of the things that came up a lot was, is this crisis action-inducing or action-forcing? Is it actually finally shaking policymakers into saying we need to take these policy questions much more seriously and treat them with much greater urgency? And I'm not totally confident about that. I think the question about getting civil society groups and media and universities and researchers, IFPRI has done some great work and try to kind of, what are the trade-offs of different policy choices diplomatically? So I wondered, David, if you want to say something about how does our humanitarian assistance kind of insist on the fundamental policy changes? You can't make it necessarily conditional, but how do you embed that in it? And actually to all of our speakers, Ute, to you, and policy change in Zimbabwe is a tough one, Anne, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well. And then let's open up for some questions.
So I think there's a couple threads here, but I mean, what you describe in Mozambique is economic dysfunction, which I guess is derived from political dysfunction. So the humanitarians adhere very closely to the principle of neutrality, impartiality, and integrity in their programming, so that they provide funding and support to the most vulnerable people, regardless of government structures which they are within. So whether it's a fast onset disaster or kind of a slow-rolling humanitarian disaster like you have in Syria, we in the humanitarian community will always help the most vulnerable. And so that's kind of a bright line rule. And we don't condition that. By the way, most of the disasters or the complex emergencies that we're facing around the world right now are self-induced, I would say, as opposed to natural disasters. So it's not only going to be Southern Africa that's going to face these challenges. I mean, Syria is a self-induced humanitarian complex crisis. That is, however, distinct from the governance function and the development function in which we operate. And I think it's imperative that we have real and frank conversations with the leadership. And when you have a regime that's extractive, where economic and political elites extract wealth from the country, then what you have is a situation like we have in Malawi, where we keep paying over and over and over and over again, and a situation in Botswana where we don't pay. I mean, we still give support to Botswana in other ways through PEPFAR or whatever. So I think we need to be rigorous and we need to be real. And it's also going to come at the price of two other points. Our bureau is stretched. Right, we're facing complex crises around the world, and if Malawi can't get it right, they also bear some risk themselves because we are being really stretched elsewhere. And just I guess a couple quick data points. So the budget since Nancy Lindbergh was the assistant administrator, which was less than 2 years ago, has increased 75%. It's all humanitarian assistance. The budget for DACA's increased 375% since the beginning of the Obama administration. Okay, this money is not, manna from heaven. It's coming at the expense of other accounts, and so at the end of the day, we're going to have to push harder and lean in on the governance function.
Ute, do you want to respond on? Is this mobilizing action?
Yes, thank you. Well, the topic of governance is obviously one where there are no easy answers, and I should say from the perspective of Mozambique that live in this country, clearly this is not the best time that Mozambique has had in recent years. We have security challenges, we have a political crisis, we have an economic crisis. Whose fault is that? It's probably a bit futile to ask. I would just say that while things have recently heated up clearly between the government and the partners, many of those partners have also been supporting many of the activities here for many years. So Clearly, it's a complex question. But let's also keep in mind where Mozambique comes from. And really, just a bit over 20 years ago, Mozambique came out of a really long first fight for independence, immediately followed by a devastating civil war. So really, at that time, in the early mid-90s, they were almost at zero. And they have come a long way since then, with significant support from the partners, the donor community over all these years. And I think we have really also seen a lot of progress. What we have is, I think in many aspects of food security, nutrition, agriculture, we have many good policies, we have many good intentions. What is clearly still lacking is the rollout of these programs in the field, having the capacity to implement and to reach out, including to the rural areas, to bring these services and these initiatives to the people. But keep in mind, Mozambique really had to come from a very difficult point to start and has made a lot of progress already. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ute. Andy.
Yes, I have the hardest. But just to add 2 points in Zimbabwe, I think when the president declared a disaster in February, I think some people viewed this as potentially an opportunity by acknowledging the problem that existed and the lack of capacity within the Zimbabwe government. One thing that we did see when we were on the ground, the relevant ministries in the humanitarian response are sitting alongside the humanitarians in several working groups. I think that's a positive. What we don't want to see is any closing of humanitarian space in the coming months. And given the insecurity in Zimbabwe right now, that should be followed quite closely.
Thank you. Okay, let's take maybe 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then we'll turn to our panel. Yes, sir. And please wait for the mic and identify yourself. We have a web audience that's following along.
Hi, my name is Rudy Teton. I'm actually from the southern region, or Southern African region. I spent 8 years in Malawi from 2003 to 2011, and we lived through the famine of 2005, 2006 in the health sector. So my perspective is a bit different. But I think one big issue, and it relates to the governments in Southern Africa, is probably the whole issue of land use. Who owns land? Who manages land? Especially in that very much of Southern Africa there's not much enough water, so it really poses a challenge for agriculture. So how do folks really begin to operate in that space to manage agriculture and food production?
Yes, sir.
I'm Mark Stuckert with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Thank you very much for CSIS putting on this event and the experts' presentations. I'm not sure who said it, but somebody once said, you should never waste a crisis. And one observation and then a question. Observation number 1, I was just sitting here, Googled Southern Africa food crisis. There's hardly anything on it on the internet. You guys got to do a much better job of publicizing that there is a crisis. I think this is perhaps one of, if not the biggest, food famine crisis. And you don't like to use the word famine, but when you report here, CSIS, 4 out of 10 children are stunted already. Stunting is not a stunt. This is a bad crisis. People are starving to death. Make it public. Number 2, what about, I was very taken by Richard, your remarks at the beginning, we have to use this strategically, proactively. We have a huge population growth in Africa. And if it keeps going the way it grows, if the cycle of drought and flooding gets worse and worse through climate change, we're going to see enormous amounts of starvation. You mentioned, David, 2.5 million people starving to death in Ethiopia the last time around. The United States, for political reasons, can't seem to address the population problem. it's become a political issue. I don't know how that happened, but it's happened. How do we engage our foreign partners to address this if we, the United States government, the United States of America, can't? Thank you.
Thank you.
Teresa Casali from PAI. I was wondering if any of you guys could speak a little bit to the gender components of this food crisis. I know that often in food crisis and other crises around the world that women and girls can sometimes bear the brunt of the vulnerabilities that play out. And if you could talk a little bit about that, and then what are some of the things being done to mitigate those impacts?
When we have land tenure, we have publicity around the food crisis, especially when there are so many competing demands on humanitarian funds and so many appeals out there. We have population growth and then the gender component. Richard, do you want to say anything on any aspect of it?
Sure, I'll touch on a couple of them very briefly. Land use and land tenure, yes, is an underlying issue in both of the countries that we visited. And you can sort of particularly in Malawi, into that question as well. Yeah, I think there are things that the government can be doing in policy terms to pass laws that give more, that give clearer guidance on land tenure. But as you say, it's about investing in the land that people have as well, and there was a lot of talk when we were in Malawi on from the government side about plans to, they have Lake Malawi going the way down one side of the country, using that water more effectively and getting large irrigation projects up and running. There was a little bit of caution, I think, from the donor side on that, that big industrial-sized irrigation projects can also become white elephant projects. There's opportunities that are created for graft and corruption if they're not managed properly. So, but certainly, land use is an issue. Insecure land tenure is a disincentive to invest. But getting quality land and irrigated land is a critical one. In terms of, we heard various people in our conversations on the trip talk of this crisis as, and I don't want to misphrase it or make it sound callous, but crisis as an opportunity to really focus minds. And I think the gravity and the scale of this crisis, okay, this is a part of the world where you do get perennial food insecurity and drought, but the scale of this season's drought has really focused minds, and there was no mistaking the fact that it was right on the top of the agenda for both governments in the countries that we visited. Regarding your question around gender, certainly I have nothing more to add other than anecdotal evidence from discussions that we had, but certainly there is a important gender component to this drought. When you hear stories from women in communities that we visited that they just have to walk further and further and further every day just to find either firewood to prepare meals, or walk further for water, or find adequate sources of water. That's putting a huge strain on families, and there's definitely a security component to that as well. So yes, I think that's an important point you raise.
Okay, and I do have some very smart colleagues here. Beth Dunford, who's the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Food Security, and Dina Esposito, who's the Director for Food for Peace. Obviously, I would agree with Richard on the land issues. It not only unlocks, it's a governance issue, but it also unlocks wealth for individuals and community. I think that's pretty important. And by the way, you can do high yield, effective agriculture on rather small plots of land too, particularly if you can get the irrigation and the technology right. On publishing or notifying that this is a crisis, just so I'm clear, this is not a famine. This is a food insecure crisis. Whether it tips into a famine or not is kind of the Rubicon, and I don't think that we're expecting that this is going to tip into a famine. It's food insecurity, so there's a big difference there. This helps publicize it. We have also worked to kind of note our robust El Nino response in Africa. Not only Southern Africa, but more broadly. We did send out a DART, a Disaster Assistance Response Team, to Ethiopia early in the year to get ahead of the food insecurity issues. We're kind of taking a preventive approach to avoid a famine. We actually don't even use that word. We're addressing head on the food insecurity issues, and so getting a DART team out to Ethiopia was very much a part of that. But we've done a fair amount of media and efforts, but I think we need to be realistic. We are in the last few months of an intensely interesting political season here. And we have major crises that are sucking up oxygen elsewhere in the foreign policy circle. And even today, we have a Category 4 hurricane bearing down on the Caribbean. And so tomorrow and tonight and yesterday, I'll be speaking about that challenge that's ahead of us. So I do want to be able to put Southern Africa in some context. Just in terms of gender, and I'm going to turn it over to you guys, but I would guess that the gender metrics are dramatically improved from 1966 or 1986 until today. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do. The evidence is very clear that if we get the gender balance right, you get a much better impact for your dollars, for sure. But I wanted to ask both of you, in terms of either youth or gender, if you have anything to add.
Hi, my name is Beth Dunford. I'm head of the Bureau for Food Security, which is head of the Feed the Future initiative, which is addressing the root causes of hunger and poverty. And just on the gender piece, I wanted to just talk about the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which I think is a really important tool that we use to measure women's empowerment. It's the first time we've really pulled together an index around agriculture that gives us some quantifiable metrics that we can compare against. I think it also really serves as a diagnostic tool. It looks at things like women's membership in groups, control over productive assets, time management, and the rest, just to really help really also inform our programming. So I think the way we understand gender in these areas is really important, and of course, increasing evidence that women's empowerment has a direct correlation to nutrition levels is really important as well. But I'll turn it over to Dina to talk about more the emergency side.
Thanks. I don't have a lot to add. I think just in general, we've been very concerned about the dynamics of this drought on gender issues, and we heard a little bit in Zimbabwe about the concerns that women are having to go further and further afield to seek resources, but also some evidence from the Protection Cluster research in Zimbabwe that commercial sex trafficking is up, migration. I think obviously the HIV/AIDS rates and the failure to take medications are having knock-on effects as well. So our work, NOFDA's work, includes both assistance and protection. In this case, I often say that assistance is protection. I mean, we can talk about protection, but if women don't get the assistance they need to make better choices and resist the worst of the coping mechanisms they have available to them, then we have a major problem. But we're certainly always open to learning and new ideas about how to marry those two ideas of assistance and protection. Thanks.
Just another impact that we heard, a huge number of young men and men from southern Mozambique go to South Africa for jobs and send back remittances. Now, with the fall of the rand and the problems with the South African economy, those remittances have gone down dramatically. So presumably for women and children who have remained at home, there's an added burden. Ute, do you want to say something on the publicity angle? I mean, one of the things, again, that we heard was the slowness of the governments to call this out as an emergency. And part of that was kind of a reluctance to admit there was anything wrong, as Anne said, for the President Mugabe to come out and say that is pretty significant. And one was the data feeding into those choices. And Mozambique initially had the Statistics Bureau, the Research Bureau came up with 650,000, I think it was, people at risk. And 3 months later, it jumped to 1.2 million. So the data that feeds into the decisions is important as well. But Ute, do you want to say something on any aspect of those questions?
Yes, well, let me start with gender, and thank you really for bringing that into the discussion. I think we can say that from the perspective of the humanitarian country team, all of us partners here in Mozambique currently working together, we do realize that this is probably another opportunity to remind us that, yes, we have to do more also about gender. But there are many initiatives by certain agencies. Certainly we as WFP try to inject gender aspects into many of our programs. Also, UN Women is working with the government National Disaster Management Agency to make sure that gender aspects are more prominently considered in the government's emergency preparedness and response activities. But surely we can do more. So I think generally we also feel this needs more attention. Since you asked about the data and the raising the alarm and so on, it is true, data has been a concern in the country. And but I think we can also say that maybe since you were here a few months ago, we have had another food security and nutrition assessment. The data were collected in July. And the government agency, which is responsible for doing these food security and nutrition assessments, called CETSAN, they already get a lot of support from various partners in conducting these assessments. And for the last assessment, we have worked with them even more closely. We have also now used the IPC methodology for both food security and nutrition analysis. Obviously, data will never be perfect. There cannot still be a lot of discussion around it, but I think we have certainly seen huge improvements compared to where we were 1 year ago, and certainly the kind of data that we worked with at the beginning of this emergency, when indeed other countries in the region were already talking more forcefully about something being wrong in their countries. I think also the government was maybe initially a little bit having to catch up to the severity of the situation, but we've also seen a lot of change at that level.
Great, thank you. Anne, yeah.
Yeah, just one quick point, Mark, to the advocacy messaging around this. A couple of challenges that we saw on the ground. First of all, in Zimbabwe, you have, as I mentioned, sort of a traditional sort of development lens with the actors on the ground right now. And for those to switch to a humanitarian response and an emergency response, it's tricky, right? And so the advocacy messaging, I think there's a disconnect right now on getting visibility on what is the most urgent thing to fund right now. More broadly, I think the bigger challenge is what I raised on what OCHA is dealing with. They have Southern and East Africa in their portfolios. A lot of INGOs have made this decision as well, going back to 2014. So you are basically comparing what's happening in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in the same basket as what's happening in Southern Africa. And you're fighting up against a Southern Africa that traditionally, in the minds of many humanitarians, is resilient. And so what we've been trying to do with our messaging to U.S. government and international donors is to lay out what I laid out before, which is why this is different now, why Southern Africa is not going to be able, despite its infrastructure and comparatively stronger infrastructure than East Africa, is absolutely in an emergency context right now.
More questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. My name is Kristen Wells. I work with CARE, and we have pretty extensive offices and programs in that region. And I wanted to ask and have comment and question. The question is really about the in-kind provision of food in Zimbabwe. We've have strongly supported USAID's flexibility and the use of cash vouchers, but we're also concerned about too much of a shift to in-kind, especially where the local markets are still working despite price increases. So I wanted to get some sense of where you think that's going and whether, if the food crisis continues, whether that leads to a greater shift of in-kind in that region. We were concerned about the impact on the markets, basically, and what would happen if those weakened markets collapse even further. I also wanted to ask about malnutrition in Madagascar, which I know is a severe problem, and just raise the fact on the gender issue that we have with CARE and have worked with other aid partners, a number of successful programs providing cash transfers in Mozambique, providing assistance through the GRAD program in Ethiopia, where we've worked directly with women and small holder farmers at the community level who have been finding that they are more resistant to the impacts of El Nino in this cycle than their neighbors and neighboring towns have been. So I think that there's good groundwork for some of the gender successes that we've seen, and we'd love to know more about what USAID is looking to do to expand those success stories.
Okay, great. Yes, on the side, and then the gentleman.
Hello, Chelsea Reinberg with Project Concern International. The question I had was regarding markets. So we know that there's obviously a lack of food, but what about the food that is remaining? Are these areas that are being severely hit being almost exploited in terms of very few profit or very few companies that are coming in and buying them for a low price compared to other parts like in Mozambique where there maybe is a higher crop in the northern part and compared to the southern part? And is there a big change, did you see maybe in the amount of profit that these people were getting paid for that same crop in the different areas?
Okay, and the gentleman on the aisle, and then we'll come here.
Thank you. Eric Arduino with Catholic Relief Services. I guess a couple of points. One, I'm very intrigued by this idea of crisis modifiers being applied to Feed the Future in a broader sense that I think the gentleman, Richard, has brought up, and kind of curious to see how that might play out in USAID's thoughts about that. I know that we've, as an implementer of food aid programming, we've been able to use crisis modifiers. I'm not sure we called it originally that, but that in places like South Sudan and Mali, and right now we're doing that in both Malawi and Madagascar, expanding the reach of our ability within the development programming to respond to the emergency needs. So seeing that in a broader sense throughout all of the Feed the Future, the different aspects of Feed the Future, Food for Peace being one of them. And then second, I haven't had a chance, admittedly, to read it yet, but I understand USAID has just recently published their Global Food Security Strategy submission to Congress. And in there, the one part I did have a chance to just take a quick peek at was targeting. And curious as to whether or not this crisis has weighed in, how this crisis rather has weighed into your plans or expectations around targeting, particularly going back to that sort of divide, the traditional divide between serving the most vulnerable who aren't necessarily market ready, but can be after time, and those who are more market ready, but not necessarily the most vulnerable.
Great, thank you. Let's go here, and then the gentleman there. We'll take a cluster together.
Yeah, David Hempson, Impact Evaluator Consultant from Southern Africa. One point I didn't pick up, either in a quick scan of the documents or in the discussion, is the storage of food. You have fat years and lean. And I know there is some controversy about the management of policies in relation to storage in Malawi in 2005, 2006, when they were strongly advised to get rid of all their stocks, and then they had a famine. And I wonder how this issue is managed, so you don't get massive bureaucratic establishments and more boards, which are notorious in the region and don't do their job. But at the same time, there is a need for strategic planning and storage, and I wonder how that's being dealt with.
Okay, we'll answer these and then we'll come back for another round. We don't want to get the list too big.
Let's mix it up.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
All right. Well, I will dive in on, Kristen, on your question, given the very relevant question on in-kind food assistance. The reason we're supporting this in sort of the crisis modifier lens, and the reason that we said this was basically what we saw on the ground in rural areas. Despite some of the language around how accessible cash assistance was to the rural population, that certainly wasn't what we saw when we were interviewing people in the rural areas, both in Matabeleland North and Masvingo. So for us, we feel like for this emergency context, in-kind food assistance has to be part of the response. The other concern that we had on cash vouchers, not only because of the liquidity crisis that's going on, but there are different market assessments that different organizations are using to justify what is working. So as an example, to say, well, 70% of my recipients are able to access their cash assistance through vouchers or other ways. The problem is the complexities of reaching that cash assistance in the stories that we heard. For example, how long a woman had to walk to reach a cash point. And so these are the complexities that I think, to give a little bit of credit on the cash assistance discussion that's going on in Zimbabwe, since we left, I think there's been a lot more discussion on the different sort of risk leading into the next lean season for accessibility, and I think that's being thought through. But there are multiple challenges to the strategy, and so with that in mind, especially given the lack of access to food that we saw from the people that we interviewed, we do believe in-kind food assistance is an essential part of the strategy right now.
Ute, do you want to say something on both the vouchers question and the markets and private sector players coming in and making money off of this?
Obviously, the question of in-kind cash or vouchers is a hot topic in the region and certainly also for us in Mozambique. We currently have a mix. Many of the NGOs are using vouchers. We as WFP have so far used only in-kind assistance. Maybe to cut the long story a little bit short, we have created a working group under the food security cluster that WFP is co-chairing to try to come up with harmonized approaches between the different humanitarian partners. And the aim is to have something that is also agreed by the government, to have common protocols, common systems, whether it is around market access or it is around defining the triggers that would define when to use what modality in which areas, or it is about the value of a voucher or a cash assistance, all these different parameters of the assistance. We are working now in a very constructive way to try and use the same approaches across agencies. We as WFP have done a market assessment in July. Our finding was that in the areas that we surveyed, and it did not cover the whole country or even all the provinces affected by the drought, the market conditions were not currently conducive to using cash or vouchers, that indeed in-kind assistance was the best response. But the assessment also said that we have to keep monitoring, and we have an electronic market price monitoring system, also MVAM, that we are setting up. So as soon as the conditions allow, we will also use, and where possible, probably vouchers along with this harmonized approach. In terms of people making money off this crisis, it's a bit difficult to say really. But we found that, many of the traders are obviously also complaining about the current situation, about having enough stocks, about where to find the stocks, whether they find them in the north of Mozambique or they do bring them in from other countries. By and large, the ability of traders to adequately supply the markets, as we have found in our market assessment, is also currently very much challenged. And in areas where you may have had many more traders, you currently have only one. so if at all. So it's a mixed bag, but clearly it needs to be closely monitored, and traders need to be a part of that assessment of saying, can we use something other than giving people directly in-kind assistance? But let me also say, really, we have been grateful to have received in-kind assistance so far and have been able to use that so far. We believe so far it has been, in many parts of the country, the more adequate modality.
Would you like to say something on the targeting?
I'm not going to say anything on the targeting. I'm going to let Beth say on the targeting. Let me just make one or two quick points on the crisis modifiers. So as we move forward as an agency, we're going to have to be more adaptable and flexible in our procurement and our contracting mechanisms. But you should be able, if there's not crisis modifiers that are embedded in the agreement, to be able to figure out how you tweak that in, even in a post-award environment. I think it's entirely possible. Just on the food vouchers versus in-kind. So I'm going to quote a former defense secretary, which is, you go to war with the army you have, not the army that you want. Food is a big, complicated political deal in the United States. We actually have gotten increasingly more flexibility in how we get our food, and so actually we're able to respond better. It's also the case that in-kind contribution might protect markets rather than distort markets. What we don't do is distort markets, and we work very hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. On the targeting, Beth, I'm going to ask you if you could jump in.
Thanks. As Kimberly mentioned in the opening, and also our colleague here mentioned, we recently submitted our global food security strategy to Congress over the weekend. It's on the feedthefuture.gov website. We did elevate resilience as one of 3 objectives in the strategy, and what that does is 3 things. It helps us really increase our focus on helping communities, people, individuals, countries manage risk, building their adaptive capacity, which is important for this. It also, as you mentioned, really informs our targeting, and it helps us find the right balance between inclusive ag-led growth in areas of high potential and where there's high poverty and malnutrition, and balancing that with really addressing the underlying causes of crisis and going to areas of recurrent crisis. And so balancing all of that together is how we inform our targeting. I think the elevation of resilience says we'll be more putting a lot of focus on really making sure that we're targeting areas of recurrent crisis. Third, this really make sure that we increase our focus on shock responsive development. And crisis modifier is one important element, one important tool in that toolbox, but really making sure that our programs are shock responsive, and when they're on the ground, they can work very closely with humanitarian partners to respond. But just to emphasize, this is addressing the root causes of hunger and poverty. When I went to Ethiopia as a young Foreign Service officer in 2002 on the eve of that crisis, in which 14 million people were at risk of starvation. In 2003, we spent $500 million on emergency assistance and $5 million on agriculture. And so we're so excited with Feed the Future to have the resources to make a sustained investment in addressing the root causes of hunger and poverty. And really, I think elevating resilience says we want to work more closely with our humanitarian partners, but again, it is really working at addressing the underlying causes of hunger and poverty.
Just on the stocks issue, I mean, one of the challenges is that last year was a very bad year too, and so stocks were depleted. Another was a few years ago, Malawi lost 30% of its grain reserve due to leaky warehouses or silos. So that's definitely an area, but the whole region right now is kind of depleted in terms of stocks for kind of a safety cushion. Richard?
Yeah, there's also the issue in Malawi with the state marketing board, grain marketing board, ADMARC, which in theory is supposed to help stabilize the price of maize, which is the staple for people there, by buying directly from the farmer and then selling at a subsidized price to the public, but which isn't working according to plan at all. They're very, very unclear, opaque rules according to when it does enter the market, and I think a report by IFPRI, which works in the country, actually suggests that Malawi has the highest price volatility in the whole region. So clearly something is going on there, and the marketing board is not working in the way it is intended to.
Considered something of a political slush fund, too, since it actually makes money. Let's take two quick more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I know I had pointed to the gentleman here, and we'll go to Brad. And Steve.
My name is Jean Tsafak. I'm from Futures Agribusiness. I want to start by pointing out some facts. In the world at this moment, we are addressing the food crisis issue, in the next coming years, and climate change issue. And we all know, as many of the economic around the world are saying, that Africa is, the continent from hopeful. They say that Africa, from hopeless continent to the hopeful continent, means that Africa have a lot of land, arable land, that we can grow food and feed the world, the whole world. Now, given the fact that even in Africa we are having that issue, of food crisis in Southern Africa, but there is something wrong. There's something going on. I don't know how to address it. At this point in time, we work in 18 countries in Africa. What we do, we work with private sector, identifying existing projects and increasing, taking their business at the next level. But the challenges that they are facing right now, most of those projects are, they are looking for investor, lack of capital access. And then there is a lot of, good, I would say, good image that we are just, throwing away and say, hey, these are the issue, but a lot have been done. What you are doing is a lot, but we need to also look at that angle that, okay, there is something we can do even in Africa to solve African problem. So that is what I wanted to see, how we can plug that angle into in the holistic approach to solve African problem. And what someone just mentioned, that in Mozambique, there is a lot of food in the north, and they lack food in south. And then, yes, we see that in Congo, in Kinshasa, and we saw that in Cameroon, but this have been addressed, by, solving the infrastructure and the energy problem.
Yeah.
So these are the areas that if the foreign aid can address in different countries, yes, those problems will be solved. Okay, This is my thought on.
Okay, thank you very much. And then Brad, last question.
Thank you. Brad Gutierrez, independent researcher. My simple question is, how do we take the great lessons learned in Botswana from 1965 and apply them today across the region? The context of that question is, I'm a longtime Africanist, 30 plus years, and it has been one of the things we've forgotten to mention here is the region we're talking about used to be the breadbasket of the continent. My brother-in-law is a farmer, lost his farm to Mugabe, is now in Zambia farming in grains and doing very well. But one of the things that comes up all the time is this issue of how do we get, and this goes back to the markets question, how do we get farmers who are farming to focus on consumable grains as opposed to seed grains? Because the seed grains tend to be more profitable for them, export, et cetera. And so a lot of the farmers will concentrate on the seed growing seed grains rather than the consumable grains, and that all just puts increased pressure on the drought, on the the food security and other issues. So basically the big question is governance. How do you get Botswana lessons applied elsewhere? But recognizing that this is an area of the world that really does have the capacity to grow tremendous amounts of consumables, but just doesn't seem to be doing it right now.
Thank you. It's funny, someone the other day said in Democratic Republic of Congo, if you just spit, something will grow. It shouldn't be, food security should not be a problem in DRC. Should we kind of go along the line here and answer those questions or wrap with? Okay. Okay, let's go with
So I love the Hopeful Africa point. I love it. And I also get your point, which is how do we kind of extrapolate from 1966 Botswana to where we are today? So I've been in the Foreign Service for a while, and I've been overseas for a long time. I actually had not been back to Southern Africa for 32 years until this spring. So when we look at the despair that we see right now, and this is why I keep drilling home the context. So when I went to Southern Africa in May, everything was different, right? South Africa was not an apartheid state. It's a free state. Namibia, when I was last in Southern Africa, didn't exist because it was Southwest Africa and they were fighting SWAPO. And there are places that are worse, Zimbabwe, for sure. Malawi has not made a lot of progress. But there's enough hope that's out there. And why do I say that? Renewable energy is an extremely exciting prospect in Southern Africa. And you can see this in some of the pilot demonstrations that are going forward. Irrigation and kind of high-tech irrigation is just around the corner. The technology environment, the mobile technology environment that you see in Southern Africa is just starting to germinate. And they're using some exciting technology in Southern Africa on elections that we're going to use elsewhere. Everybody in Southern Africa, maybe not everybody, but most people in Southern Africa have a cell phone, right? And by the way, they have to pay for it. And everybody pays for their cell phone. And somehow they're able to get the power to charge their cell phone, even if they have to take it to the store and charge it there. So are there threads that are interesting and meaningful and valuable? I think the answer is yes. Now, I was just at an Africa strategic dialogue earlier this morning. And you can't see the map, but there's mainly red, which means conflict and danger and bad things, and a little bit of green. Green means freedom. Green means democracy. Green means governance. So Southern Africa is green. The reason why we got to make Southern Africa work is because we need to take the green in Southern Africa and move it up and move it further. So yeah, we got to take the green to Mozambique. We got to take the green to Swaziland and Zimbabwe and Malawi. But you know what? There's enough interesting, hopeful Africa stories and hopeful African business leaders out there. Yalla Africa. I don't think I need to say any more. Yalla Africa, right? The young leaders that are going to change the world.
And the demonstration effect that comes from the successes. And I think Greg Collins in the video said, you know, he's talking about Kenya and Ethiopia. If it's possible in Ethiopia, it's possible elsewhere as well. Let's go for final comments. Anne?
Yeah, I would just on sort of the hopeless to hopeful. Something I haven't raised from the Zimbabwe context that's really important is we haven't really focused enough on how much of a reliance the economy is on agriculture in Zimbabwe. And so we were asked quite a bit during our 2 weeks in Zimbabwe about migration due to the drought. And first of all, there's really no good data on that, which is why that's a policy recommendation in our report. And that also includes cross-border and economic migration, which has traditionally gone to South Africa. And South Africa has already been laid out as having a difficult time of its own. But just getting back to the opportunities for livelihoods in Zimbabwe, something interesting, and this is just anecdotally, so I want to sort of reinforce this because there's not good data behind it. But we were surprised when we were meeting with some of the rural communities. So do you want to move to the urban settings to find jobs? This is sort of the traditional narrative, right? We heard time and again, both in Matabeleland North and Masvingo, why would we move to the urban areas? There are no jobs there. So we actually heard more about people moving from the urban settings back to the rural areas, despite the difficulties that are being found in the agriculture sector right now, because that is traditionally what they know, and they believe that they'll be able to get something out of the ground. So I just paint this picture as it's an additional hurdle at a time when the political tensions and economic crisis are ongoing in Zimbabwe. You also have a different narrative on how people are looking ahead to livelihood opportunities, and those are very real challenges for Zimbabwe.
Great, thank you. Ute, final words?
Yes, not easy, but let me also say Yalla Africa, I can fully subscribe to that. And I think it's good to have a perspective to this which says we're no longer in the Ethiopia of 1984, you know, it is really a different continent and a different region. Also, it is true, Mozambique, if I should speak just for Mozambique, has lots of resources, and not least also the human resources. People have a lot of stamina and are very resourceful themselves. They have been exposed to difficult conditions for the longest time. Sometimes people just need a little bit of help to basically be able to look after themselves. That the whole thing needs to be packed in a context of good governance, I think is very obvious. I don't have to comment much on that. But so clearly, I think there can be a very clear positive note, but for the time being and in the very short term, we really have to support the people who are suffering and who will continue to suffer, and there will be more suffering. So let's also not forget that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ute. Richard.
I have nothing much more to add. Only to address your point on the importance of the private sector, and I couldn't agree more with the potential transformative impact that the private sector could have in both of the countries we looked at. And here's where the government leadership, I think, is important. There are a lot of barriers to investment in both of those countries, and quite an unfriendly and difficult environment for the private sector to operate in. We heard about this unofficial sort of maize export ban, for example, in Malawi, which you can sort of understand in the midst of this current crisis, but it hardly encourages more investors to get into the ag sector. Feed the Future is working hard in this area in trying to develop value chains around agriculture and bring more players in, and I think that's really, really important. At the moment, the ag sectors in both countries are dominated by a few sort of big entities, and broadening out that sector and bringing more competition into the marketplace, I think, will be very critical going forward.
Great. Listen, this has been really great. We thank you, David. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Ute. I think my takeaway is, the urgency of responding to this crisis now, which has so many millions at risk, but to also sustain the sense of urgency around the policy reforms that set the basis for more sustainable agricultural growth and food security. The problem when the crisis is over, do people then lapse back and forget? And I think it's very important. This time, it is a crisis like none that we've seen in recent years. We need to keep that sense of urgency forward. Listen, thank you.